My name is Clara. I'm 32 years old and I'm currently being sued for $5.5 million by the two people who abandoned me at an airport terminal when I was 5. They didn't want me when I was a hungry child with a teddy bear, but they certainly want me now that I'm an heiress. The smell of burnt coffee and floor wax always makes my stomach turn. It's a physical reaction, a jagged memory clawing its way up my throat. I was 5 years old, sitting on a bolt-down plastic chair in Terminal 3 of O'Hare. The seat was too deep, making my legs dangle and itch against the rough edge of my denim overalls. My mother, Diane, knelt in front of me. Her hair smelled like cheap hairspray and cigarettes. She tucked a loose strand of my blonde hair behind my ear, her fingers trembling slightly. "Stay right here, Clara," she whispered. Her eyes darted toward the departures board. "We're just going to get some snacks. Pretzels and those gummy bears you like. Don't move. If you move, we won't find you." I squeezed my tattered teddy bear, Barnaby, so hard his stuffing started to leak. I watched their backs. My father, Victor's broad shoulders, and Diane's frantic stride as they disappeared into the sea of travelers. I stayed. I stayed for 4 hours until a security guard found me crying silently, my face masked in salt and grime. 27 years later, the rain in Seattle feels like those same tears. I stood at the edge of a fresh grave, the hem of my black silk dress soaked through. The cemetery was a blur of gray headstones and weeping willow trees. Arthur was gone. The man who had found me in the foster system 2 years after the airport, the man who taught me how to ride a bike and how to read a balance sheet, was under 6 feet of cold earth. "He loved you more than anything, Clara," Sarah, his longtime assistant, whispered as she placed a hand on my shoulder. "He was the only one who ever stayed," I replied, my voice cracking. As the crowd dispersed, I caught a glimpse of a black sedan parked near the gates. A man and a woman stood beside it, partially shielded by a large umbrella. They weren't dressed for a funeral. They looked like they were scouting a location. Even from a distance, something about the woman's posture, that frantic bird-like tilt of the head, sent a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the rain. I shook it off. My mind was playing tricks on me. Grief does that. It makes you see ghosts where there are only strangers. I turned back to the grave, whispering a final goodbye to the man who gave me a name and a future. I had no idea that the $5.5 million he had left me was about to act like blood in the water, calling the sharks back home. The air in Mr. Sterling's office smelled of expensive leather and old, dust-covered law books. It was a heavy, suffocating scent that seemed to press against my chest. I sat in a velvet armchair, my fingers tracing the silver locket Arthur had given me for my 16th birthday. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat, adjusting his spectacles. "Arthur was very specific, Clara. He wanted to ensure you never had to worry about the what-ifs ever again." He slid a thick folder across the mahogany desk. My eyes blurred as I looked at the numbers. The primary estate, the lake house, and a diversified trust fund. Total valuation $5.5 million. "It's a lot to carry," I whispered. "It's a legacy," Sterling corrected gently. "He saw your talent for design, but he also saw your need for a fortress. This is your fortress, Clara." I left the office feeling like I was walking on glass. The money didn't feel like a win. It felt like a responsibility to the man who had rescued me. But the fortress was already under siege. 3 days later, I was in my studio, surrounded by fabric swatches and architectural blueprints, when the doorbell rang. It wasn't the postman. It was a process server in a wrinkled suit who handed me a thick manila envelope without making eye contact. "Clara Miller Vance, you've been served." My heart hammered against my ribs as I tore the envelope open. Civil summons, Miller versus Vance. My breath hitched. The names hit me like a physical blow. Victor and Diane Miller. The legal jargon was a tangled mess of lies, but the core of it was clear. They were claiming the adoption was fraudulent, that they had never signed away their rights, and that as my rightful parents, they were entitled to half of my inheritance. The mediation room was freezing. I sat on one side of a long, sterile table, flanked by my lawyer, a sharp woman named Alina. On the other side sat two people who looked like gnarled, weathered versions of the ghosts from my nightmares. Victor wore a cheap, ill-fitting suit that smelled of stale sweat. Diane had caked-on makeup that settled into the deep lines around her mouth. She didn't look at me with love. She looked at me like a winning lottery ticket. "Clara, honey," Diane started, her voice a forced, raspy croak. "We've spent every day since that airport looking for you. We were devastated. We thought you wandered off while we were getting those snacks." "I waited 4 hours," I said, my voice surprisingly steady despite the ice in my veins. "I didn't wander. You left." "We were young and scared, Clara," Victor cut in, leaning forward. His eyes were cold, calculating. Now it's only fair that his estate pays for the years of heartache we suffered. "Heartache?" I let out a dry, hollow laugh. "You abandoned a 5-year-old at an international terminal. There is no price tag for that. You're not getting a cent." Diane's face shifted. The grieving mother mask slipped, revealing a sharp, ugly sneer. "We'll see about that, dear. We're your blood. That old man was just a stranger with a checkbook." I stood up, my chair screeching against the tile floor. I couldn't breathe in the same room as them. I walked out, their laughter, a sharp, jagged sound, following me down the hallway. The fortress Arthur built for me started to feel like it was made of sand. A week after the mediation, I sat in Elena's office again. This time, the air didn't smell like leather. It felt thick with the static of a brewing storm. Elena was tapping a pen against a grainy black and white printout of a document from 1999. "It's a clerical error, Clara, a stupid 30-year-old mistake," she said, her voice tight. "The caseworker who handled your transition from foster care to Arthur's guardianship failed to file the final termination of parental rights decree in the correct county. On paper, there's a missing link, a gap." "A gap?" I felt a cold sweat prickle my hairline. "I lived with him for 25 years. He raised me. He's on my birth certificate." "An amended birth certificate," Alina corrected. "The Miller's lawyer is smart. He's arguing that because the original rights weren't technically dissolved by the state of Illinois before the Washington adoption, the whole process was procedurally flawed. They're calling it a kidnapping sanctioned by the state." I leaned back, the blood rushing in my ears. I wasn't a daughter. I was a legal technicality. The nightmare moved from the courtroom to the streets the next morning. I was walking into my studio, a coffee in one hand and my iPad in the other, when a man with a heavy camera jumped out from behind a parked van. The flash was blinding, a white-hot explosion in my eyes. "Clara, is it true you're letting your biological parents starve while you sit on $5 million? He yelled, shoving a microphone toward my face. "Get away from me," I snapped, fumbling with my keys. By noon, the headline was everywhere. From airport orphan to heartless heiress, the millionaire daughter who forgot her roots. There was a photo of Diane, looking frail and wiping away a fake tear, standing in front of a dilapidated trailer.
Beside it was a photo of me from a gala last year, wearing a designer gown and smiling. The contrast was sickening. They were painting me as the villain of my own life. The phone in my studio didn't stop ringing, but it wasn't new clients. It was Mrs. Gable, a high-end client whose penthouse I was currently redesigning. "Clara, dear," she said, her voice dripping with that polite Seattle frost. "We've seen the news. My husband and I feel that having such public drama associated with our project isn't a good fit for our brand. We're going to put the contract on hold." I hung up the phone, the silence of the studio suddenly feeling like the silence of that airport terminal. I looked at the fabric swatches on my table, silks, velvets, linens, all the beautiful things I used to build worlds for other people. Now my own world was being stripped bare. I felt small. I felt like that 5-year-old girl again, waiting for a snack that was never coming, realizing that no matter how much money I had, I was still just something someone wanted to throw away. The fear didn't leave, but it hardened. It settled in my gut like a cold stone, turning my grief into a sharp, jagged edge of determination. If Victor and Diane wanted to play the part of the grieving, wronged parents, I was going to find out exactly what kind of grief they had been practicing for 30 years. I met Marcus in a diner that smelled of burnt toast and rainy pavement. He was a retired detective with a face like a crumpled paper bag and eyes that had seen too many versions of the truth. "You're looking for ghosts, Clara," Marcus said, stirring a spoonful of sugar into his black coffee. 30 years is a lot of time for people to bury their trash. "They aren't ghosts," I said, leaning over the laminate table. My voice was low, vibrating with a new kind of energy. "They're in my city, trying to take the only thing I have left of my father. I need to know why they really left me at that airport. People don't just lose a child at a gate and wait 30 years to find her." Marcus nodded slowly. "I'll start with Chicago, the police reports, the child services files, and the money. People like that always have a trail of paper followed by a trail of debt." For 3 days, I lived on caffeine and nerves. I couldn't work on my designs. The colors felt muted, the fabrics dull. I spent my hours in the local library, scrolling through digitized archives of Chicago newspapers from the late 90s. My eyes ached from the flickering light of the microfiche machine. Then I found it. A small headline tucked away in the back of a July 1998 edition of the Chicago Tribune. "Local couple pleads for missing daughter's return." There was a photo. Diane was wearing the same floral jacket I remembered from the airport. She was holding my favorite teddy bear, not Barnaby, but a newer one I hadn't seen before. She looked devastated. But as I read further, the bile rose in my throat. Underneath the plea for my return was a mention of a Clara Miller Memorial Fund set up for tips and community support. A week later, another article, an insurance payout for accidental trauma and a settlement from the airport security firm for negligence. They hadn't just abandoned me. They had used my disappearance to stage a performance. They had turned my abandonment into a payday. My hands shook as I printed the pages. The clicking of the printer sounded like a heartbeat. I wasn't just a child they didn't want. I was a commodity they had cashed in, and now, 30 years later, they were coming back to the well for one more drink. "Not this time," I whispered to the empty library. "Not ever again." I didn't go back to my studio that night. I drove straight to Arthur's house. My house now. It was a craftsman-style estate perched on a hill, overlooking the dark, churning waters of the Sound. It had always been my sanctuary, a place of cedar-scented hallways and warm amber light. But as I pulled into the driveway, the motion sensor lights didn't just flicker on, they revealed something that made my blood run cold. The front door was ajar. I didn't call the police. My hand was already on the heavy brass handle, pushing it open. The silence of the house had been replaced by a rhythmic, heavy thud coming from the kitchen. I walked in, my heels clicking like a countdown on the hardwood. There, sitting at the marble island, was Victor. He had his boots up on the counter, a bottle of Arthur's vintage scotch open beside him. Diane was in the living room, her fingers trailing over the velvet upholstery of the sofa I'd picked out with Arthur 3 years ago. "What are you doing in my house?" My voice didn't shake. It was as cold and sharp as a winter morning. "Our house, sugar," Diane said, turning around. She was wearing a silk scarf she'd clearly taken from my closet. "The lawyer says that since the adoption was questionable, this estate is part of a contested trust. We're just inspecting our future property." "Get out," I said, stepping toward Victor. "I have the deed. I have the keys. You're trespassing." Victor took a slow, deliberate swig of the scotch, then slammed the glass down on the marble. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "The law's a funny thing, Clara. Right now it says we have a colorable claim. That means until the judge says otherwise, we have as much right to be here as you do. Maybe more. We're family. This old man was just a thief in a suit." He stood up, his height meant to intimidate me. He walked over to the fireplace mantel where a framed photo of Arthur and me stood. It was taken the day I graduated from college. Arthur was beaming, his arm around my shoulder, looking at me with the kind of pride that made me feel invincible. "Nice photo," Victor sneered. "Looks expensive." Before I could move, he swept his hand across the mantel. The frame hit the hearth with a sickening crack. The glass shattered into 1,000 jagged diamonds, slicing right through Arthur's face in the photograph. "Oops," Victor said, his eyes dancing with a cruel, dark light. A scream stayed trapped in my chest, turning into something harder, something deadlier. I looked at the shattered glass, then up at the man who shared my DNA but possessed none of my soul. "You think this makes me weak? You think breaking a picture changes who he was to me?" "I think you're a little girl who's about to be homeless again," Victor said, leaning in so close I could smell the scotch on his breath. "Unless you sign over the $5.5 million. We'll walk away. We'll leave you this drafty old house and go back to our lives. But if you fight, we'll strip this place to the studs." I didn't answer. I walked to the door and opened it wide, the cold Seattle wind rushing in, swirling the dust and the ghosts around us. "The trial starts in 3 days," I said, my voice as steady as a heartbeat. "Bring your best lies, because I'm bringing the truth, and the truth is going to bury you." The courtroom felt like a cathedral of cold, white marble and polished oak. The air was pressurized, smelling of old paper and the ozone of a struggling air conditioner. I sat at the plaintiff's table, my back so straight it ached. My blonde hair was pulled back into a severe low bun. I wore a charcoal suit, my armor for the day I had to defend my right to exist as Arthur's daughter. Across the aisle, Victor and Diane looked transformed. Gone were the greasy jackets and the sneers. Diane wore a modest navy dress and a strand of fake pearls, her face scrubbed clean of the heavy makeup, replaced by a practiced expression of fragile sorrow. Victor kept his head bowed, looking like a man broken by a system that had stolen his child. "The court calls Mr. Harold Thorne," the bailiff's voice boomed. Their lawyer, a man who looked like a shark in a 3-piece suit, stood up. He didn't look at me, he looked at the judge. Your Honor, we are here to correct a 30-year-old injustice. My clients didn't lose their daughter. She was taken by a man who used his immense wealth to bypass the laws of this state. Objection. Elena's voice was a whip crack. Unsubstantiated. Sustained, the judge muttered, but the poison was already in the air. The morning was a blur of technicalities and dry testimonies from records clerks, but the afternoon brought the hammer. Thorne stepped toward the witness stand, holding a single sheet of yellowed, cream-colored stationery. My heart skipped. I recognized that paper. It was from Arthur's personal desk. Your Honor, Thorne said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hum, we have recently recovered a letter written by the late Arthur Vance just 6 months before his passing. It was found among documents he had sent to a former business associate for safekeeping. He began to read. The voice coming out of his mouth wasn't Arthur's, but the words, they were a nightmare. I've lived with a shadow over my heart for decades, the letter read. The way I obtained Clara was not through the light of the law. I knew the Millers hadn't signed those papers. I paid to make the problem go away. I only hope she can forgive me when the truth comes out. The courtroom went silent. I felt like I was underwater. My vision tunneled until all I could see was that piece of paper. Arthur wouldn't say that. He couldn't. It was his handwriting, the elegant looping A, the way he crossed his T's with a slight upward flick. Clara? Elena whispered, touching my arm. Her hand was ice cold. Is that his writing? It looks like it, I breathed, the words tasting like ash. But it's a lie. He would never. He loved me. The evidence suggests otherwise, Thorne said, turning to look at me for the first time. He smiled, a slow, predatory baring of teeth. It suggests he bought a daughter, and my clients are the ones who paid the price in tears. I looked at Diane. She pulled out a handkerchief and dabbed at her eyes, her gaze meeting mine over the white lace. There was no grief there, only victory. As the judge called for a recess, I stumbled out into the hallway. The walls felt like they were closing in. I had spent my whole life running from the airport terminal, only to find myself trapped in another one, waiting for a savior who was no longer there to catch me. Everything, the house, the $5.5 million, the very name I carried, felt like it was dissolving into ink and lies.
The bathroom mirror in the courthouse was unforgiving. It showed every hour of sleep I'd lost, the hollows under my eyes, and the way my charcoal suit seemed to hang off a frame that was becoming more skeletal by the day. I splashed cold water on my face, the chill snapping me back to the present. Clara! I spun around. Marcus stood in the doorway, his wrinkled tan jacket damp from the rain. He didn't look tired anymore. He looked electrified. He held a small, battered leather logbook and was followed by a man who looked like a stiff breeze could knock him over. "This is Arthur Henderson," Marcus said, his voice a low rumble. He was the night shift security lead at O'Hare in July of '98, and he kept every personal log he ever wrote. The elderly man adjusted his cap, his eyes milky with age, but sharp with recognition. "I remember you, little one," he whispered. "You had a bear, Barnaby, right? You didn't cry, you just sat there like a statue." My heart hammered. "You were there?" "I was the one who called the social worker," Henderson said. "And I'm the one who kept what your mother left in your bag. The police didn't want it. They said it wasn't evidence of a crime back then, just a civil desertion. But I knew better." We walked back into that courtroom like a firing squad. The Miller's lawyer was still smirking, leaning back in his chair.
Diane was busy dabbing her dry eyes, but when Elena called Arthur Henderson to the stand, the smirk flickered. "Mr. Henderson," Elena said, her voice echoing in the silent chamber, "you were on duty the night Clara was found. Tell us about the backpack she was carrying." "It was a pink Barbie bag," Henderson said, his voice thin but clear. "The parents had stuffed it with 2 changes of clothes, a half-eaten bag of pretzels, and an envelope. I found the envelope tucked into the lining when I was looking for an ID." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, yellowed piece of paper encased in plastic. "My clients didn't leave a note," Thorne shouted, standing up. "This is a fabrication." "Let him speak, Mr. Thorne," the judge barked. Henderson read the note. It wasn't elegant like the forged letter. It was a jagged, panicked scrawl on the back of a grocery receipt. "We can't do this anymore. She's better off with the state. Don't look for us. We're starting over." The courtroom gasped. The air seemed to leave Diane's lungs in a visible hiss. "But that's not all, Your Honor," Elena continued, stepping toward the Millers. She dropped a stack of documents onto their table with a heavy thud. "These are records from the Illinois Department of Insurance. Victor and Diane Miller filed a claim for accidental loss of a dependent and emotional trauma exactly 48 hours after they left Clara at the airport. They didn't look for her. They cashed her in." I looked at Victor. His face had turned a sickly, bruised purple. The grieving father was gone, replaced by the cornered animal I remembered from my kitchen. "And as for this letter," Elena held up the confession from Arthur, "we've had a forensic document examiner look at the digital scans during the recess. The ink is less than a year old. The paper is vintage, yes, likely stolen from Mr. Vance's estate when the Millers trespassed last week, but the handwriting, it's a sophisticated forgery." The judge looked at the Millers, her eyes narrowing with a cold, judicial fury. "Mr. Thorne, I suggest you have a very long talk with your clients before I refer this entire matter to the district attorney for fraud, perjury, and extortion." Diane let out a low, keening wail, not of grief, but of a gambler who had just lost her last cent. I didn't feel pity. I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders, a 30-year-old burden finally crashing to the floor.
The silence that followed the judge's final gavel was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It wasn't the ringing silence of Terminal 3. It was the heavy, peaceful quiet of a debt finally paid. Victor and Diane weren't allowed to leave through the front doors. As the judge ordered a formal investigation into their evidence, they were escorted out through a side exit by 2 bailiffs. I stood in the gallery and watched them. Victor's shoulders were slumped, his bravado evaporated. Diane was still clutching that white handkerchief, but her eyes were darting around like a trapped fox. She looked at me one last time, her mouth opening as if to beg, but I simply turned my back. I was no longer the girl waiting for her to come back with snacks. I was the woman who had seen her clearly. A month later, the Seattle sun finally broke through the perpetual gray, casting long, golden fingers across the hardwood floors of Arthur's estate. The house was mine again. The broken frame on the hearth had been replaced. The new photo showed Arthur and me on the deck of his sailboat, both of us laughing so hard our eyes were closed. It wasn't just a picture, it was an anchor. Elena sat at the kitchen island, the same one Victor had defiled with his boots, and pushed a final set of papers toward me. "The countersuit is settled, Clara. Between the fraud charges and the emotional distress claim, the Millers have been ordered to pay back every cent of the insurance money they stole in '98, plus damages. They're filing for bankruptcy, and the DA is moving forward with the perjury charges."
And the $5.5 million? I asked, looking out at the water. It's secure, every penny. I picked up a pen, but I didn't sign for myself. I signed the documents establishing the Arthur Vance Foundation. It would provide housing, legal aid, and college scholarships for children who aged out of the foster care system without a family to catch them. Arthur had given me a fortress, and now I was using his stones to build a bridge for others. That evening, I drove to the studio. The clients who had left during the scandal were calling back, offering sheepish apologies and new contracts. I ignored the messages for a moment and walked to the back of the room. There, sitting in a glass display case on my desk, was Barnaby. The old teddy bear was missing an eye, and his fur was matted with decades of dust and tears. For years, he had been a symbol of what I had lost, of the girl who wasn't wanted. But as I touched the cool glass, I realized he was actually a symbol of what I had survived. I wasn't a miller, and I wasn't just an orphan. I was the daughter of a man who chose me, and the architect of a life I had built with my own 2 hands. I picked up my drafting pencil and looked at a blank blueprint. The lines were crisp, the possibilities infinite. I wasn't waiting at the gate anymore. I had finally arrived home.